Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to part 1 of 2 on my how to river table build. This is a black walnut and blue slate epoxy river table, and in this video I show you guys step by step how I got everything prepped and ready for this river table all the way up to the pour. If you want to see how I tapered off my edges and the type of finish that I used on this table, please stay tuned for my next video. Let's get started. So I took my client up to see Jake at Old Log and Sawmill. He's a buddy of mine who I've learned a lot of this stuff from, and kind of spitballed and brainstormed. They picked out these 2 beautiful slabs with some decay in the middle, and then they also picked out these sweet legs. So I put everything in my truck, got everything back to the shop, and I started cutting on the edges. So I lined up what I wanted my river to look like, and then I started cutting one straight edge on each of the slabs so that it would fit into my mold. Then you want to take your time and you want to really focus on cleaning out any softwood, debris, dirt, mud that is in your slab, especially slabs with decay in the middle. I used a chisel and a Dremel, sander, and a grinder to clean everything up. It is really important to try to get as much of that debris out of your slab as you can so that it doesn't float up whenever you go to pour your epoxy later. Next up, I started making my mold. I use this 4x8 sheet of MDF, which you can get at Lowe's or Home Depot. Whenever you're prepping your mold, always make sure each of your edges are roughly an inch over your end goal, because you will have to go back and clean these edges up once you're done and everything is demolded. So the client wanted this table to be 7 feet by 4 feet, so I cut my mold at 7 feet and 2 inches, and luckily MDF comes just a little over 4 feet, giving you plenty of wiggle room to go ahead and cut off those edges in the end. I will also go ahead and tell you guys that I made it really close with the edges for my mold. Always make sure that your sides are at least an inch thicker than your table thickness plus the bottom of your mold, so that when you're doing your pour you have plenty of height on those sides. I definitely needed to make mine about 3/4 inches higher. Once you get all your pieces cut, go ahead and start covering everything in Tyvek tape. This helps your table release from your mold when it's all said and done. One thing that I didn't show here was I did use a universal mold release, which I will link that in the description below, as well as some of the other tools and materials that I used in this video. I did a little test fit because I hadn't cut my slabs to their final size yet, so I put them in my mold and then I proceeded to cut off what I didn't need. Once I got all of that done, I went ahead and cleaned up my slabs a little bit more. Like I have emphasized this so many times, you really can't get them clean enough. So I went back with my sander and my Dremel, just getting any sort of that dead wood out of the cracks and off of the surface so that when I go to pour my epoxy, nothing is going to float up. I went ahead and finished up my mold. I put the last 2 edges on. Whenever I make my molds, I always add silicone to where I attach my pieces as well as the crease once everything is put together. The last thing you want to see when you go to pour epoxy is a leak. Those are really expensive mistakes to come back from. Always make sure you pre-drill your holes before you put in your screws, and this will ensure that you don't have any blowouts or cracking in your mold whenever you put it all together. I just use 1 5/8 inch screws. You could probably use even a little bit shorter, but this pulled everything together nicely for me, and it's what I had on hand, so I made it work. If you guys are going to use mold release, now would be the time to do it. Spray it on top of that Tyvek tape, but make sure you keep it away from your wood. Now it is finally time to pour some epoxy. I'm using Chemtec epoxy here, as well as the Blue Slate Pigment by Black Diamond Pigments. I set my timer for 5 minutes and I thoroughly mixed throughout my entire time, scraping the sides and the bottom. Don't do what I did here and pull your paddle mixer up a little too high, introducing more bubbles in that mixing process than you really need to. But just a paddle mixer, which you can also get at Lowe's or Home Depot, and your drill, mix thoroughly for 5 minutes and start pouring some epoxy. The only advice that I have here, aside from have fun and enjoy this, is one, make sure you are in a climate controlled area. You want to make sure that your shop or your house is set on 68 to 70 degrees. And then you also want to make sure that you have plenty of fans on deck. I had ceiling fans, and then I also had some floor box fans, just blowing on that epoxy, keeping it cool, because if you've done your research, you know that epoxy heats up as it cures. So keeping it cool as it cures is very important. I believe if it was to heat up too quickly, your epoxy would crack, which you would be devastated, and there's really no coming back from that once everything is all poured and done. The only other last tip that I have when you're pouring this epoxy is to fill up your mold completely. You want to encase all of your slabs and sides and edges in this epoxy. And then your cure time really depends on what kind of epoxy you're using. Again, I'm using Chemtec. They're all going to average about the same, 5 days to a week. I let mine go ahead and sit that full 7 days just to ensure that it reaches its maximum hardness. And then once it is all cured, I am going to start taking this thing out of its mold. As you guys can kind of see right here, I completely filled that mold to the brim with epoxy. So as I mentioned earlier, when you're cutting the edges and the sides for everything, make sure you give yourself plenty of depth. Ideally, you would have like a 1/2 inch, barrier before you really got close to the top of that thing. So once I got all my sides removed, I used a pack of shims to start breaking that bond between the bottom of my mold and the table. This thing was a beast, so it took a lot of shims to get it removed, but once I got all of the edges kind of pried up, it came up fairly easily. So all in all, I would say that the mold release does help because it was easier to get up than my last table, which was a little bit smaller than this one. So once everything is taken out of the mold and I got everything lifted up, I packed it up, loaded it, took it up to Old Log and Sawmill to get it flattened on the Slabmizer. I used a little blow-up lake floaty and I laid it in the bottom of my trailer to try to ensure that that table was protected from any scratches, especially once it was surfaced. The last thing you want to do is put a huge gash in the top or underside of your customer's table, especially once you've come this far. Once it was there, we put it on the Slabmizer. It probably took about 2 or more hours to surface the top and bottom of this thing. And a huge shout out to those guys for making it happen. This was a really, really enjoyable process. I loved watching that epoxy come off there and that exposed wood. It does leave those bug holes, especially in that area where you have that decay and rot, but all in all, it turned out great, and we can use some CA glue, as you'll see in my next video, to kind of fill those gashes. So I loaded my table up, I took it back home, and that pretty much concludes part 1 of this river table build. If you like this video at all, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. While you're at it, please subscribe and stay tuned for part 2 of my next video, which I will break down the rest of this table from the chamfered edges all the way up to delivery.